Our new life begins next week, my husband said when he arrived with his pregnant mistress. The words hit me like a sledgehammer to my chest, 40 years of marriage crumbling in an instant. I watched my reflection in our bedroom mirror that night and barely recognized the broken woman staring back at me. Today I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Margaret, and at 67 years old, I thought I knew exactly who I was. I was the woman who ironed David's shirts every Sunday morning, the wife who kept our small Brooklyn apartment spotless despite the constant dust from the construction next door. I was the woman who saved every penny from my part-time job at the local bakery, stashing away dollar bills in an old coffee tin, dreaming of the retirement we'd planned together. That Tuesday evening in October, I was wearing my favorite lavender cardigan, the one David had bought me for our 35th anniversary. The fabric was soft against my weathered hands as I stirred the pot of beef stew I'd been simmering all afternoon. The smell of rosemary and thyme filled our tiny kitchen, mixing with the distant sound of sirens that never seemed to stop in our neighborhood. I had set the table with our good china, the set we'd received as a wedding gift, and rarely used because David always said it was too fancy for everyday meals. I heard his key in the lock at 7:15, 15 minutes later than usual. I remember checking the clock on the microwave, wondering if traffic on the Brooklyn Bridge had been particularly bad. But when the door opened, 2 sets of footsteps echoed through our narrow hallway instead of one. My heart stuttered when I saw her. She couldn't have been more than 30, with glossy brown hair that caught the light from our overhead fixture, and skin that glowed with youth and health. Her hand rested protectively over her rounded belly, and she wore a designer coat that probably cost more than I made in 3 months at the bakery. The diamond on her finger sparkled, catching my attention immediately because it was at least twice the size of my own modest wedding band. David stood beside her, his gray hair neatly combed, wearing the navy suit I had dry cleaned just last week. His face held an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of defiance and something that looked almost like relief. He cleared his throat, that familiar gesture he made when he was about to deliver news he knew would upset me. "Margaret," he said, his voice steady but cold, "we need to talk." I turned off the burner under the stew, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for the wooden spoon. The kitchen suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in around us. The young woman smiled at me, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who had already won a game I didn't even know we were playing. "This is Rebecca," David continued, placing his hand on her lower back with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. "She's carrying my child. We've been together for 2 years and we've decided to make this official. Our new life begins next week." The spoon slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor. 2 years. While I had been planning surprise birthday parties for him, while I had been putting aside money for our dream vacation to Ireland, while I had been lying awake at night worrying about his health when he came home later and later from work, he had been building a life with someone else. Rebecca stepped forward, her heels clicking against our worn linoleum. "I know this must be difficult for you, Margaret," she said, her voice sickeningly sweet, "but David and I are in love, and this baby deserves to grow up in a real family, a happy family." The implication stung more than any slap could have. We weren't a real family. Our 40 years together, the mortgage we'd paid off together, the vacations we'd saved for, the nights I'd held him when he cried about his father's death, the mornings I'd made his coffee exactly how he liked it, the way I'd learned to sleep on my side of the bed even when he wasn't there so he'd have his space when he came home. None of it was real. None of it mattered. I looked at David, searching his face for any sign of the man I'd married all those years ago in the small chapel in Queens. His mother had cried during the ceremony, not from joy but from disappointment that her son was marrying a baker's daughter instead of the lawyer's daughter she'd had her heart set on. But David had told me none of that mattered, that love was all we needed. Now, standing in our kitchen with his pregnant mistress beside him, love seemed like the most foolish thing I'd ever believed in. "I've already spoken to a lawyer," David continued, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a manila envelope. "These are divorce papers. I'm prepared to be generous with the settlement, but I need you to sign them by Friday. Rebecca and I have found a house in Manhattan, and we're moving this weekend." Manhattan. Of course they were moving to Manhattan. I'd lived in Brooklyn my entire life, had raised our 2 children in this neighborhood, had built friendships with the woman who ran the corner deli and the man who fixed our car when it broke down. But Manhattan was where successful people lived, where David's law practice had flourished over the years while I'd remained in the same small world, content with my simple life. I bent to pick up the wooden spoon, my knees protesting with sharp pains that reminded me I wasn't young anymore. When I straightened up, both of them were watching me with expressions of pity mixed with impatience, as if I were a child who needed to be managed. I need some time to think, I managed to say, though thinking felt impossible with the roar of blood in my ears. David shook his head. There's nothing to think about, Margaret. This is happening whether you cooperate or not. I'm trying to make this easy for you. Easy. As if 40 years of marriage could be dissolved easily. As if the life we'd built together could be packed up and discarded like old furniture. I thought about the photo albums I'd carefully maintained over the decades, documenting every birthday, every holiday, every milestone. I thought about the garden I'd planted on our tiny fire escape, the herbs I'd grown specifically to cook his favorite meals. I thought about the retirement account I'd been contributing to faithfully, even when money was tight, because I believed we'd grow old together. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, her hand moving in small circles over her belly. Maybe we should go, David. She needs time to process. But David wasn't finished. There's something else, he said, his tone growing sharper. The money in our joint savings account, Margaret. I'm going to need most of it for the down payment on the new house and to set up the nursery. You understand? I stared at him, feeling as if I were seeing a stranger. The savings account contained nearly $30,000, money I'd accumulated over years of careful budgeting and sacrifice. Every time I'd wanted to splurge on a new dress or a night out with friends, I'd reminded myself of our future together. Every time I'd worked overtime at the bakery, standing on my feet for 10 hours straight despite the arthritis in my knees, I'd put the extra money aside. That's my money too, I said quietly. David's expression hardened. It's our money. And I have more expenses now. Rebecca isn't working, obviously. And the baby will need everything. You can keep working at the bakery. You always said you enjoyed it there. Enjoyed it. As if kneading bread at 5 in the morning and dealing with demanding customers all day was something I did for pleasure rather than necessity. As if the ache in my back and the calluses on my hands were signs of fulfillment rather than survival. I looked around our kitchen, at the pictures of our children stuck to the refrigerator with magnets, at the calendar where I'd marked important dates in red ink, at the coffee maker I'd programmed the night before so David would have fresh coffee when he woke up. In a few days, none of this would be mine anymore. In a few days, I'd be starting over at 67, with nothing but whatever David decided I deserved. I should call the children, I said, reaching for the phone on the counter. I've already told them, David replied quickly. They understand that this is for the best. The betrayal cut deeper than I thought possible. Not only had he been planning this behind my back, but he'd involved our children, had presented his version of events before I even knew what was happening. I wondered what he'd told them, how he'd justified abandoning their mother for a woman young enough to be their sister. Rebecca checked her watch, an expensive-looking piece that caught the light like her engagement ring. We really should go, she said to David. I have my appointment with the decorator at 8, and you know how Dr. Morrison feels about expectant mothers and stress. Dr. Morrison. Even her doctor had a name I recognized from David's conversations about his wealthy clients. Everything about her life gleamed with the kind of money and status I'd never been able to provide. I thought about my own doctor, the family practitioner I'd been seeing for 20 years in a cramped office above the pharmacy, who always seemed rushed and rarely remembered my name. After they left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the pot of stew that had been simmering for hours and now smelled burned. The manila envelope lay on the counter where David had left it, thick with documents I didn't have the courage to open yet. The apartment felt different already, as if his announcement had somehow changed the very air inside our walls. I walked to our bedroom, past the framed photos of our wedding day and family vacations, past the bookshelf where I kept the romance novels David always teased me about reading. In the closet, I pulled out the small jewelry box where I kept the few pieces of value I owned, inherited from my mother and grandmother. My grandmother's pearl necklace, my mother's gold bracelet, the diamond earrings David had given me for our 10th anniversary when money was tighter, but his gestures were more meaningful. Would I have to sell these things to survive? Would Rebecca be wearing new jewelry bought with the money from our joint account while I pawned the treasures of my family history? I sat on the edge of our bed, the mattress dipping under my weight in the familiar way it had for decades. How many nights had I lain here, listening to David's breathing, feeling grateful for the solid presence of his body beside mine? How many mornings had I woken up first, careful not to disturb him as I slipped out to start the coffee and begin another day of caring for our family? The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I answered it with a trembling hand, hoping it might be one of the children calling to tell me they didn't understand, that they wanted to hear my side of the story. Instead, it was my daughter Sarah, her voice tight with forced cheerfulness. Mom, Dad told us what's happening. I just want you to know that Kevin and I think it's probably for the best. You and Dad haven't seemed happy in a long time. Happy. When had happiness become the only thing that mattered in a marriage? When had commitment and partnership and shared history become less important than the fleeting emotions that come and go like weather? Sarah, I began, but she interrupted me. I know it's hard, Mom, but you're still young enough to start over. And think about it. No more cooking for someone who doesn't appreciate it. No more cleaning up after Dad's messes. You can do whatever you want now. Whatever I wanted. At 67, with arthritis in my joints and cataracts beginning to cloud my vision, with $30,000 disappearing from my savings account and a divorce I hadn't asked for, what exactly did she think I wanted? The important thing is that everyone stays civil, Sarah continued. For the family's sake. You know Dad's practice is doing really well right now, and Rebecca seems nice enough. Maybe you could all be friends eventually. Friends. With the woman who had stolen my husband and my future. With the woman who was carrying the grandchild that should have been mine to spoil. Sarah's words felt like stones thrown at an already shattered window. After I hung up, I called my son Michael. His reaction was similar but colder, more concerned with the practical implications than the emotional ones. Look, Mom, divorce happens. At least Dad's offering you a decent settlement. You should take it and move on. Move on. As if 40 years could be folded up and stored away like seasonal clothing. As if the dreams I'd nurtured and the sacrifices I'd made could be dismissed with two simple words. Neither of my children asked how I was feeling. Neither of them offered to come over, to sit with me while I tried to make sense of the wreckage of my life. They had already accepted their father's new reality, had already begun thinking of Rebecca as part of the family while mentally moving me to the periphery. I spent that night sitting in David's chair, the leather recliner he'd bought himself for his 60th birthday. It was too big for me, too masculine, but being surrounded by the shape his body had worn into the cushions felt like holding on to something familiar in a world that had suddenly become foreign. The manila envelope lay unopened on the coffee table. Every time I looked at it, my chest tightened with panic. Inside those papers was the legal dissolution of everything I thought I knew about my life. Inside was the acknowledgement that the woman I'd been for 4 decades was being erased, replaced by someone I didn't recognize and hadn't chosen to become. I thought about the years when the children were small, when money was so tight that I'd reuse tea bags and darned socks rather than buy new ones. David was just starting his practice then, working long hours and bringing home barely enough to cover the rent. I'd taken evening jobs, cleaning offices and babysitting neighborhood children, anything to help us stay afloat while he built his career. It's temporary, he'd promised me back then. Once the practice takes off, you won't have to work so hard. We'll have everything we've dreamed of. But even after the practice became successful, even after we moved to a better apartment and could afford small luxuries, I'd kept working. Not because we needed the money anymore, but because David had become accustomed to the extra income. It funded his expensive suits and business lunches, his membership at the golf club where he networking with other lawyers and judges. I'd never minded, really. I'd been proud of his success, had felt that my contributions made it possible. Every dollar I earned felt like an investment in our shared future, in the retirement we'd spend traveling and spoiling grandchildren, and finally having time for each other. Now that future belonged to someone else. Rebecca would be the one to enjoy the fruits of my labor, to live in the house bought with money I'd helped save, to wear jewelry purchased with funds I'd contributed. She'd be the one to grow old with David, to be there when his hair went completely gray and his steps grew slower. The irony was sharp and bitter. For years, I'd worked to support his dream of success, and now that success was being used to leave me behind. The money I'd saved had become the tool of my own abandonment. I finally opened the divorce papers at 3 a.m, when the sounds of the city had quieted to occasional sirens and distant music from the bar down the street. The legal language was dense and intimidating, full of terms I didn't understand, but the basic message was clear enough. David was offering me $15,000 from our joint savings, plus half the value of our apartment. It sounded generous until I calculated what it actually meant. The apartment was worth maybe $200,000 in Brooklyn's inflated market, which meant my share would be $100,000. But where would I live with that money? A 1-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood would cost at least $800 a month in rent. More if I wanted to stay somewhere safe and close to the bakery. My Social Security payments wouldn't begin for another year, and even then they'd barely cover basic expenses. David knew all of this, of course. His offer was calculated to seem fair while ensuring I'd struggle to maintain any kind of comfortable life. Meanwhile, he and Rebecca would be living in Manhattan luxury, their combined resources allowing them to hire nannies and housekeepers, to send their child to private schools and summer camps I could never afford for my own grandchildren. The phone rang again at 6 a.m, jolting me awake from the fitful doze I'd fallen into in David's chair. I expected it to be one of the children checking on me, but instead it was Mrs. Patel from the apartment next door. "Margaret, dear," she said, her accented voice warm with concern. "I heard raised voices last night and I've been worried about you. Are you all right?" Mrs. Patel had lived next door for 8 years, ever since her husband died and her children moved her from her house in Queens to be closer to her son's family in Brooklyn. We'd developed a friendship over shared cups of tea and conversations about the changing neighborhood, about the challenges of aging and the loneliness that seemed to creep in despite our best efforts to stay connected to the world. "I'm fine," I lied, but my voice betrayed me with its shakiness. "No, you're not," she said firmly. "I'm making chai, and you're coming over. Bring your troubles with you." Mrs. Patel's apartment was a mirror image of mine but felt completely different, filled with the rich smells of cumin and cardamom, with bright fabrics and family photos covering every surface. She was a tiny woman, barely 5 feet tall, but her presence filled rooms with warmth and authority. She listened without interruption as I told her everything, occasionally refilling my cup with the spiced tea that seemed to carry healing properties beyond its ability to warm my cold hands. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes thoughtful. 40 years, she finally said. 40 years you gave to this man, and now he wants to throw you away like yesterday's newspaper. Her directness was exactly what I needed to hear. No platitudes about happiness or moving on, no suggestions that maybe this was for the best. Just acknowledgement of the injustice, validation of my pain. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked. "I don't know how to be alone. I don't know who I am without him." Mrs. Patel leaned forward, her weathered hands grasping mine. "You are Margaret. You are a woman who worked 2 jobs to put a man through law school. You are a mother who raised children and kept a home and stayed faithful for 4 decades. You are a woman who deserves respect, not this shabby treatment." Her words were like oxygen to someone who'd been drowning. For the first time since David's announcement, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. It might have been anger or dignity, or simply the recognition that Mrs. Patel was right. I did deserve better than this. "But what can I do about it?" I pressed. "You can stop accepting scraps from a man who thinks you should be grateful for them," she replied. "You can remember that you have value beyond what he chooses to give you." Over the next few days, I began to see my situation more clearly. David had made his plans in secret, had aligned our children and his lawyer and his new woman against me, had presented me with a fait accompli that assumed I'd have no choice but to accept whatever terms he offered. He'd counted on my passivity, on the 40 years of training that had taught me to put his needs first and my own second. But Mrs. Patel's words had planted a seed of resistance. Why should I make this easy for him? Why should I sign papers that left me struggling while he lived in comfort? Why should I smile and play the gracious ex-wife while he enjoyed the money I'd helped him earn? I made an appointment with my own lawyer, a woman recommended by Mrs. Patel's daughter-in-law. Her name was Elena Rodriguez, and her office was in an older building in downtown Brooklyn, far from the gleaming towers where David's colleagues practiced. But when I walked into her waiting room, I was greeted by walls covered with thank you letters from clients, women who'd fought for fair settlements and won. Elena was younger than me, maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that assessed me carefully as I told my story. Unlike David's papers, which had been delivered with arrogant certainty, Elena's questions were thorough and respectful. "How much do you estimate you contributed to the household income over the course of your marriage?" she asked. I'd never calculated it before, but as we worked through the numbers together, the total was staggering. Even accounting for inflation and the years when I'd earned less, my contributions over 4 decades amounted to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money that had paid for David's education, his office equipment, his networking expenses, his wardrobe. Money that had built the success he was now using to start fresh with someone else. "And what about unpaid labor?" Elena continued. "Housekeeping, cooking, childcare, elder care. All the work you did that allowed him to focus on building his practice." Again, I'd never thought to assign monetary value to those contributions, but Elena helped me understand that they were work nonetheless. Work that would have cost thousands of dollars to hire out. Work that had freed David to pursue the career that was now funding his new life. "Mrs. Davidson," Elena said when we'd finished reviewing everything, "your husband's offer is insulting. You're entitled to much more than he's proposing, both legally and morally. But pursuing a fair settlement would mean a fight," she warned me. David clearly hoped I'd accept his terms quietly, and when I didn't, he'd likely become difficult. The process could take months, maybe longer, and it would be expensive and emotionally draining. "I'm 67 years old," I told her. "How many fights do I have left in me?" Elena smiled, and for the first time in days, I felt understood rather than pitied. "More than you think," she said, "and this one's worth having." I left her office with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. For the first time since David's announcement, I wasn't simply reacting to his decisions. I was making my own. That evening, I called David to tell him I wouldn't be signing his papers. His reaction was immediate and predictable. "This is ridiculous, Margaret. I'm being more than fair, and you know it. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "Fair?" I repeated. "You think it's fair to keep most of our savings for your new family while I start over with nothing?" "You're not starting over with nothing," he snapped. "You're getting a generous settlement." Most women your age would be grateful. Grateful. The word hung in the air between us like a slap. Grateful for being discarded after 40 years of service. Grateful for the privilege of watching him spend my money on another woman's child. "I've hired my own lawyer," I told him. The silence that followed was thick with surprise and anger. David had expected me to be hurt, maybe even devastated, but he hadn't expected me to fight back. "This is a mistake, Margaret. You're going to spend whatever you get on legal fees, and for what? Out of spite?" "Not spite," I said quietly. "Self-respect." When I hung up, my hands were shaking, but it was adrenaline rather than fear. I'd stood up to him, had refused to accept his version of what I deserved. It felt strange and frightening and exhilarating all at once. The next few weeks brought a series of increasingly hostile phone calls and text messages from David. He accused me of being vindictive, of trying to ruin his fresh start out of jealousy. He reminded me of all the ways he'd supported me over the years, all the luxuries I'd enjoyed because of his success. But the more he argued, the clearer it became that his generosity had always come with strings attached. Every gift, every kindness, every moment of financial security had been conditional on my gratitude and compliance. Now that I was challenging him, his true feelings about our marriage were becoming obvious. The children's calls became less frequent and more strained. Sarah accused me of being selfish, of putting my own needs ahead of the family's harmony. Michael was blunt in his assessment that I was making a fool of myself by fighting a battle I couldn't win. "Dad's lawyer is expensive," he pointed out. "You're going to end up with less than he offered originally, and everyone's going to be angry with you. Everyone." As if their father's happiness and Rebecca's comfort were more important than my survival. As if my 40 years of service to this family had earned me nothing but the right to disappear quietly when I was no longer needed. But Mrs. Patel continued to offer support, and Elena proved to be as tenacious as she'd promised. As we dug deeper into David's finances, we discovered assets he hadn't disclosed in his initial offer. A retirement account I'd known nothing about, investments made with money from our joint savings, even a small property upstate that he'd purchased as a business investment, but never mentioned to me. "This is why he wanted you to sign quickly," Elena explained. "He hoped you wouldn't have time to discover what you were really entitled to." The betrayal cut deep, but it also strengthened my resolve. How many other secrets had he kept? How long had he been planning this exit while I'd remained faithful and trusting? 4 months after that terrible October evening, we reached a settlement. It wasn't everything Elena had hoped for, but it was more than double David's original offer. Enough for me to buy a small one-bedroom apartment in a decent neighborhood, with money left over for living expenses while I figured out what came next. David's reaction to the final terms was bitter and personal. "You've gotten greedy in your old age, Margaret. This isn't the woman I married." He was right about that, at least. The woman he'd married had been willing to accept whatever he chose to give her. The woman I was becoming understood that acceptance and gratitude were different things, and that love without respect was just another form of exploitation. The day I signed the final papers, I felt strangely empty. Not sad exactly, but hollow, as if something essential had been carved out of me. 40 years of marriage ending in a conference room with lawyers shuffling documents and calculating assets felt anticlimactic after all the drama that had preceded it. But when I walked out of that building into the crisp December air, I also felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of David's expectations, of trying to be the wife he wanted, of pretending that his happiness was more important than my dignity, was finally gone. I spent Christmas alone that year, the first holiday in decades where I didn't cook for anyone but myself. The children were busy with their father's new family, meeting Rebecca's relatives and adjusting to the reality of their half-sibling on the way. I made a small turkey breast and watched old movies, and it wasn't the worst Christmas I'd ever had. Mrs. Patel invited me to her son's house for New Year's Eve, where I found myself surrounded by 3 generations of a family that argued and laughed and embraced with genuine affection. Watching them, I realized how long it had been since I'd felt that kind of warmth in my own family, how much of my marriage had been performance rather than connection. In January, I moved to my new apartment, a sunny one-bedroom in Park Slope, with hardwood floors and windows that actually opened. It was smaller than the place I'd shared with David, but every corner of it was mine. No one's schedule to accommodate, no one's preferences to consider, no one's mess to clean up but my own. The transition wasn't easy. Nights were the hardest, when the silence felt oppressive, and I caught myself listening for David's key in the lock. But slowly I began to fill that silence with things I'd forgotten I enjoyed. Music that wasn't classical, because David had always complained about my taste in songs. Television shows he'd considered lowbrow, books I'd wanted to read but never had time for when I was managing his schedule along with my own. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center, something I'd always wanted to try but had never pursued because David thought hobbies were frivolous for people our age. The first day, my hands were clumsy with the clay, unable to shape it into anything recognizable. But the instructor, a patient woman named Carol, who was probably 10 years younger than me, assured me that everyone started somewhere. "The clay doesn't care how old you are," she said with a smile. "It just cares about your intention." Over the weeks, as I learned to center the clay and pull it into bowls and vases, I found a kind of meditation I'd never experienced before. The world narrowed to just my hands and the spinning wheel, to the simple goal of creating something beautiful from shapeless earth. When I succeeded in making a piece that pleased me, the satisfaction was mine alone. When I failed, no one was disappointed but me. My first successful bowl was small and slightly crooked, with walls that varied in thickness and a glaze that had run more than I'd intended. But it was perfect in its imperfection, a tangible proof that I could still learn, still create, still surprise myself with new capabilities. I brought it home and placed it on my kitchen table, where it held the apples I bought at the farmer's market each Saturday. David would have criticized its asymmetry, would have suggested I stick to store-bought dishes that matched the rest of our set. But in my apartment, it was beautiful because it represented possibility, the chance to try new things without fear of judgment. Spring brought news that Rebecca had given birth to a healthy baby boy. Sarah called to tell me, her voice carefully neutral, as if she weren't sure how I'd react to the news. "His name is James," she said. "He's beautiful. Dad is, well, he's over the moon." I felt a pang of something complex. Not quite grief, but a recognition of roads not taken, of the grandmother I might have been if circumstances had been different. But the pain was distant now, like an old injury that aches when it rains but no longer dominates every waking moment. "I'm glad they're both healthy," I said, and meant it. Whatever anger I still harbored toward David and Rebecca, the baby was innocent. He deserved to grow up surrounded by love, even if that love came at the cost of my own dreams. "Maybe," Sarah said tentatively, "maybe sometime you could meet him. Dad says he's open to that if you want." The offer was meant kindly, but it revealed how little my daughter understood about what had happened. Meet the child who had replaced me in David's heart? Coo over the baby he'd chosen to have with someone else while I, his wife of 40 years, had been deemed unworthy of growing old beside him? "That's thoughtful," I told Sarah, "but I don't think that would be appropriate." She was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Are you ever going to forgive him, Mom? Are we ever going to be a normal family again? A normal family." As if David's betrayal was just a temporary disruption, a bump in the road that could be smoothed over with enough time and goodwill. As if I could simply absorb this injury the way I'd absorbed so many smaller ones over the decades, could smile and play the gracious ex-wife at birthday parties and graduations. "We weren't a normal family before," I told her gently. "We were a family where one person's needs always came first, where love was conditional on compliance. Maybe what we have now is more honest." After I hung up, I sat in my favorite chair by the window and watched the children playing in the playground across the street. Their laughter carried on the spring breeze, mixed with the sounds of traffic and construction, and all the ordinary noise of a city full of people living their lives. For 40 years, I'd measured my worth by David's approval, had shaped my days around his comfort and success. The woman I'd been had existed primarily in relation to him, as his wife, his support system, his audience. Now, at 68, I was learning to be simply Margaret, to value my own opinions and trust my own judgment. It was harder than I'd expected, this business of being alone but not lonely. There were days when I caught myself wondering what David would think of a movie I'd enjoyed or a book I'd read. Moments when I wanted to share some small observation or joke with the person who'd been my primary companion for most of my adult life. But there were also mornings when I woke up and realized I could do anything with the day ahead. I could visit the museum without worrying about David's impatience with art he didn't understand. I could meet Mrs. Patel for lunch without calculating how much time I had before I needed to be home to start dinner. I could stay up late reading or go to bed early without consulting anyone else's schedule. The bakery where I worked became less of a job and more of a social hub. Without the pressure of needing every penny to supplement our household income, I could enjoy the interactions with regular customers, the daily rhythms of mixing and baking and serving. My coworkers, mostly women closer to my daughter's age, had initially treated me with polite deference. But as I relaxed into my new independence, they began to see me as a colleague rather than just an older woman working out of necessity. "You seem different," observed Maria, who worked the morning shift with me. Happier. It was strange to think that people could see the change in me, that my transformation was visible from the outside. I'd spent so many years managing my expressions and emotions around David that I'd forgotten what it felt like to simply be myself without calculation. That summer, I did something I'd never done in my adult life. I took a vacation alone, not a big trip, just 3 days at a bed and breakfast in the Catskills, where I could walk through forests and read by a lake without anyone asking what I was thinking or suggesting I should be doing something more productive. The other guests were mostly couples, and I felt self-conscious at first, sitting alone at breakfast while they chatted across their tables about shared plans and inside jokes. But by the second day, I found myself talking to a woman about my age who was also traveling solo. Her name was Linda, and she'd been divorced for 10 years. "It gets easier," she assured me as we hiked along a wooded trail. "The first year is the hardest, when you're still expecting to turn around and find him there. But eventually you realize you're not waiting for someone else's life to begin. You're living your own, living my own life." The concept was still foreign enough to feel revolutionary. For so long, my life had been an extension of David's, my choices constrained by his preferences and expectations. The idea that I could simply decide what I wanted and pursue it, without negotiation or compromise, felt both liberating and terrifying. When I returned from the Catskills, I found a message from Elena on my answering machine. David's lawyer had called with an unusual request. David wanted to meet with me privately, without lawyers present, to discuss something important. My first instinct was suspicion. What could David possibly want to discuss now, months after our divorce had been finalized? Elena advised caution, but agreed that a brief meeting in a public place couldn't hurt, as long as I understood that I was under no obligation to agree to anything. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Brooklyn, neutral territory that belonged to neither of our old lives. David looked older than I remembered, his hair thinner and his face more deeply lined. He was dressed casually, which surprised me. In all our years together, I'd rarely seen him in anything but a suit or formal clothing. "Thank you for coming," he said as I sat down across from him. His voice was subdued, lacking the confident authority I'd grown accustomed to over 4 decades of marriage. "What do you want, David?" I asked, not unkindly but without warmth either. I'd learned to be direct in the months since our separation, to ask for what I needed and say what I meant without softening the edges. He was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it held answers to questions he was afraid to ask. When he finally looked up, his eyes were rimmed with red, and I realized with shock that he'd been crying. "I made a mistake," he said quietly. "A terrible, terrible mistake." The words hung in the air between us. I'd imagined this moment during the worst days of our divorce proceedings, had fantasized about David realizing what he'd given up and begging for forgiveness. But now that it was happening, I felt oddly detached, as if I were watching someone else's drama unfold. "With Rebecca?" I asked. He nodded, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted his coffee cup. She's not who I thought she was, Margaret. The money, the lifestyle, the status, that's all she cared about. Once the baby came, once she had what she wanted legally, she changed." I listened without commenting as David told me about the past few months. Rebecca's demands for a larger apartment, more expensive furniture, a nanny and housekeeper and personal trainer. Her complaints about his age, his appearance, his old friends who weren't sophisticated enough for the image she wanted to project. "She's talking about moving to Los Angeles," he continued, "taking James with her. Her sister lives there, and she says the business opportunities are better. She wants me to sell the practice and start over." At 65, starting over meant giving up the reputation and client base he'd spent decades building. It meant abandoning the community where he'd made his mark, following a woman who saw him as a stepping stone rather than a partner. "I've lost everything," he said, his voice breaking. "My practice is suffering because I can't focus. The children barely speak to me because Rebecca doesn't like them around. I can't sleep, can't eat. I've made the biggest mistake of my life." Despite everything he'd put me through, despite the humiliation and betrayal and months of legal battles, I found myself feeling a flicker of sympathy for the man across from me. He looked broken, diminished, like someone who'd gambled everything on a single bet and lost. But sympathy wasn't the same as forgiveness, and it certainly wasn't the same as reconciliation. "I'm sorry you're unhappy," I said carefully, "but I'm not sure why you're telling me this." David leaned forward, his eyes searching my face with desperate intensity. "Because I want to come home, Margaret. I want to fix this. I know I don't deserve it. I know I hurt you terribly, but I love you. I've always loved you. This thing with Rebecca, it was madness, a midlife crisis, whatever you want to call it. But it wasn't real. What we had was real. The coffee shop suddenly felt too small, too warm. Other conversations continued around us, the normal sounds of people going about their daily business. But I felt disconnected from all of it, suspended in this moment that I'd never fully prepared for. You want to come home? I repeated slowly. To what home, David? We're divorced. I have my own apartment now. You have a son with Rebecca. I'll fight her for custody, he said quickly. James is my son too. We can figure something out, some kind of arrangement. And your apartment, we can sell it, buy something bigger together. Start fresh. Start fresh. As if the past year hadn't happened. As if the betrayal and abandonment could be erased with good intentions and convenient forgetting. As if I hadn't spent months learning to live without him, to value my own judgment, to find satisfaction in my own company. David, I said gently, do you remember what you told me the night you brought Rebecca to our apartment? You said our new life begins next week. Well, my new life began that night too, and I'm not interested in going backward. His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like a lost child, rather than the confident lawyer I'd been married to for 40 years. Please, Margaret, I know I don't deserve another chance, but I'm begging you. I can't do this without you. Can't do this without you. After all these months of learning to do everything without him, the phrase struck me as almost absurd. He couldn't manage his own life without someone to organize it for him, couldn't find happiness without someone to sacrifice their own needs for his comfort. But I'd learned to do this without him. I'd learned to sleep alone and make decisions alone and face my fears alone. I'd discovered that I was stronger than I'd ever known, more capable than I'd ever been allowed to be when my energy was focused on supporting someone else's dreams. I think, I said carefully, that what you're really saying is that you can't do this without someone taking care of you, but that someone doesn't have to be me anymore. David stared at me as if I'd spoken in a foreign language. You don't understand, he said. Rebecca is going to take my son away from me. She's going to leave me with nothing. Nothing. He was 65 years old, with a successful law practice, a healthy body, and decades of professional relationships. He had 2 adult children who loved him, even if they were disappointed in his choices. He had financial resources that most people his age could only dream of. But without a woman to manage his domestic life and reflect his importance back to him, he considered himself to have nothing. I thought about my own life as it was now. My small apartment with its crooked pottery bowl and plants that bloomed because I remembered to water them. My job at the bakery where my co-workers had become friends. My pottery classes and evening walks and books I chose for my own pleasure. Mrs. Patel's friendship and Elena's respect and the quiet satisfaction of making my own decisions. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine for 40 years. I'm not going back, I told David quietly. I'm sorry you're unhappy, and I hope you figure out how to build a life that satisfies you. But I've already built mine. He pleaded for another hour, cycling through arguments that ranged from practical to emotional to manipulative. He promised changes he couldn't possibly make, offered concessions that missed the point entirely, reminded me of good times that now seemed like glimpses of happiness stolen between longer periods of taking him for granted. Finally, I stood up to leave. David, I said, looking down at him as he remained slumped in his chair, 40 years ago, you told me that love was all we needed. You were wrong about that. Love without respect is just need wearing a prettier name. I hope you learn to tell the difference. Walking home through the familiar Brooklyn streets, I felt something shift inside me, like a door closing softly but permanently. For months, some part of me had been waiting for this moment, wondering how I'd react if David came back. Now I knew. The woman he'd married might have taken him back, might have convinced herself that his suffering proved his love, might have prioritized keeping the family together over her own dignity. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood the difference between forgiveness and self-destruction, between compassion and compliance. That evening, I called Mrs. Patel to tell her about the meeting. She listened without comment until I finished, then laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine delight. Good for you, she said firmly. Good for you for knowing your own worth, my own worth. It had taken 68 years and a devastating betrayal to learn that my value wasn't determined by someone else's need for me, that love given freely was different from love extracted through dependency and habit. I'd spent 40 years being the woman David wanted, shaping myself around his requirements and expectations until I'd almost forgotten that I had my own desires, my own dreams, my own opinions that mattered. The divorce had been painful, but it had also been liberation from a role that had grown too small for who I was becoming. Over the following months, I heard occasional updates about David's situation through the children. Rebecca did move to Los Angeles, taking baby James with her. David followed them, closing his New York practice and starting over in a city where he knew no one and had no reputation to trade on. The children visited him once but found the atmosphere tense and uncomfortable, Rebecca clearly resentful of their presence and David caught between his old family and his new one. "He seems lost," Sarah told me during one of our now regular phone calls. "Like he doesn't know who he is anymore." I understood that feeling, remembered the months after he'd left when I'd wandered through my days wondering who Margaret was when she wasn't David's wife. The difference was that I'd been forced to find out, while David kept trying to avoid the question by making someone else responsible for his identity. My second year of independence brought changes I hadn't expected. I was promoted to assistant manager at the bakery, a recognition of competence I'd never sought but found deeply satisfying. I joined a book club at the library, where heated discussions about characters and themes stretched my mind in directions it hadn't moved for years. Most surprisingly, I began dating. His name was Frank, and he was a widower who'd lost his wife 2 years earlier after a long illness. We met at the community center, where he'd signed up for pottery classes on his daughter's recommendation that he needed to get out of the house more often. Frank's hands were as clumsy with clay as mine had been initially, and we bonded over our shared frustration with the gap between what we envisioned and what we could actually create. He was 70, 3 years older than me, with white hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Our first conversation lasted the entire 2-hour class and continued over coffee afterward. He told me about Helen, his wife of 45 years, and the long journey of her battle with Alzheimer's disease. I found myself sharing details about my divorce that I'd never told anyone but Mrs. Patel and Elena. 40 years, Frank said with a shake of his head. And he threw it away for what? A younger woman who didn't even want him once she got what she was after? It was refreshing to talk to someone who saw David's actions as clearly as I'd learned to see them. Someone who didn't suggest that I should be grateful for the experience or philosophical about the life lessons it had taught me. Frank and I began meeting regularly for coffee after pottery class, then for occasional dinners at neighborhood restaurants I'd never tried during my marriage because David preferred familiar places with predictable menus. Frank was adventurous in small ways, willing to try Indian food, interested in foreign films, curious about books outside his usual genres. He was also respectful in ways that I'd forgotten men could be. He asked my opinions and listened to my answers. He remembered things I told him and followed up with questions that showed he'd been paying attention. When I mentioned that I'd always wanted to see a Broadway show but had never managed to make it happen, he surprised me with tickets to a matinee performance of a musical that had been running for years but was new to both of us. Sitting in the darkened theater beside Frank, watching talented performers bring a story to life through song and dance, I felt a joy that was purely my own. Not reflected happiness from someone else's pleasure, not the satisfaction of having successfully anticipated someone else's needs. Just the simple delight of experiencing something beautiful that I'd chosen for myself. "Did you enjoy it?" Frank asked as we walked slowly toward the subway afterward, both of us reluctant to end the afternoon. "I loved it," I told him, and realized that I'd used the present tense automatically. Not loved it in the past, but loved it now, in this moment, as an ongoing experience that was still unfolding. That night, I lay in bed thinking about the difference between the woman I'd been and the woman I was becoming. David's version of Margaret had been careful with her emotions, had rationed her enthusiasm to avoid seeming foolish or demanding. Frank's Margaret, no, my Margaret, was learning to express delight without apology, to embrace new experiences without worry about how they reflected on anyone else. It wasn't that I'd fallen in love with Frank exactly, though I was certainly fond of him. It was that I'd fallen in love with the version of myself that existed in his company. The Margaret who felt free to laugh loudly at jokes she found funny and ask questions about subjects that interested her. Our relationship developed slowly, without the intense emotions or urgent physical attraction of youth, but with something that felt more sustainable, genuine compatibility, and mutual respect. We enjoyed each other's company without needing to complete each other, or fix each other, or sacrifice ourselves for each other's happiness. When Frank kissed me for the first time on a park bench while we watched children feed ducks in the pond, I felt something I'd almost forgotten existed. Desire that was accompanied by choice. I could kiss him back or not, could deepen the connection or keep it light, could follow my own instincts without calculating how my response would affect someone else's ego or expectations. I chose to kiss him back, and it was sweet in a way that had nothing to do with passion, and everything to do with the pleasure of being wanted by someone who also wanted my opinions, my company, my laughter, my full and complicated self. The children's reactions to Frank were mixed. Sarah was cautiously supportive, happy to see me building a social life, but worried about my vulnerability to what she called these older men who are just looking for someone to take care of them. Michael was more direct in his skepticism. "Isn't it a little soon, Mom? The divorce was only final a year ago." Only a year. As if healing from 40 years of being taken for granted should follow some predetermined timeline. As if there were rules about when abandoned wives were allowed to seek companionship again. But their concerns, while genuine, felt distant from my actual experience. Frank wasn't looking for a caretaker any more than I was looking for another person to manage. We were both competent adults who'd learned to live alone and chosen, provisionally and with full awareness of our independence, to share some of our time together. "I'm not replacing your father," I told Michael during one of our monthly phone calls. "I'm not trying to recreate what I had before. This is something completely different." And it was different. My relationship with Frank was built on who I actually was, rather than who I thought I should be. We disagreed about things without anyone needing to win or lose. We had separate interests and separate friends and separate lives that occasionally intersected in pleasant ways. When Frank mentioned that his daughter had invited him to spend Thanksgiving with her family in Boston, I felt no disappointment that I wasn't included. Instead, I was happy for him to have that time with his children, and quietly pleased with my own plans to spend the holiday with Mrs. Patel and her extended family, who'd accepted me as a friend rather than an obligation. This was what healthy relationships looked like, I realized. Not the desperate interdependence I'd mistaken for love during my marriage, but the choice to share parts of your life with someone while maintaining your own identity and autonomy. 2 years after my divorce, I received an unexpected phone call from Rebecca. Her voice on the phone was different from what I remembered, less confident and more strained. "Margaret," she said, "I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Sarah." I settled into my favorite chair, curious but wary. What could David's former mistress possibly want from me? "I wanted to apologize," she continued, "for everything. For the way I acted when I came to your apartment, for the things I said, for all of it." The apology was surprising, but I waited for the rest. In my experience, people rarely called just to acknowledge their mistakes without wanting something in return. "David and I are separated," she said after a pause. "Have been for 6 months now. He's not the man I thought he was." I almost laughed at the irony, but managed to keep my voice neutral. "I'm sorry to hear that. He talks about you constantly," Rebecca continued. "About how you understood him, how you supported his work, how you never made unreasonable demands. I think he expected me to be you, but younger. But I wasn't who David thought I was either," I realized. The woman he remembered and missed was the version of me that had existed only in relation to him, that had never been allowed to develop fully because all of her energy had been directed towards supporting his dreams and managing his needs. "Rebecca," I said gently, "why are you telling me this?" She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I wanted you to know that I understand now why he loved you so much. And I wanted to say I'm sorry for being so cruel when we met. I was threatened by you, by the history you shared with him, by the way he talked about you even when he was supposed to be with me. Threatened by me." The idea was almost absurd, given how powerless I'd felt during those terrible months of discovery and divorce. But I could see how my 40 years with David might have seemed intimidating to a younger woman who was trying to build something lasting with him. "I accept your apology," I told her, "and I hope things work out for you and James." "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I hope you know that you deserved better than what he did to you. You deserved so much better." After she hung up, I sat in the gathering dusk and thought about the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, Rebecca had been the enemy, the woman who'd stolen my husband and my future. Now she was just another woman who'd learned the hard way that David's version of love came with conditions and expectations that eventually became impossible to meet. I felt no satisfaction in her troubles, no sense of vindication that her relationship with David had failed. If anything, I felt sorry for her and for him, and for baby James, who would grow up in the wreckage of his parents' unrealistic expectations of each other. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful that I'd found the courage to fight for a fair settlement instead of accepting David's inadequate offer. Grateful for Elena's competence and Mrs. Patel's friendship and Frank's quiet companionship. Grateful for the pottery classes and book club and job responsibilities that had helped me discover who I was when I wasn't busy being who someone else needed me to be. The following spring brought news that would have devastated the woman I'd been 3 years earlier. David had suffered a heart attack while jogging in Los Angeles. He survived, but the recovery was slow and difficult. complicated by depression and anxiety about his future. Sarah called to tell me, her voice careful and hesitant. He's asking for you, Mom. He wants to see you. Wants to see me. Not needs medical care that I could provide or requires practical assistance I could offer, but simply wants my presence during a frightening time. The request was both touching and impossible. I'm sorry he's been ill, I told Sarah, but I can't help him through this. Not even a phone call? She pressed. Just to let him know you don't hate him? I didn't hate David, but I also didn't love him anymore, at least not in the way she meant. I felt the complicated affection one might have for a former friend who'd revealed themselves to be less trustworthy than you'd believed, mixed with genuine sadness for the painful consequences of his choices. But I also understood that my presence in his life, even briefly and with good intentions, would send a message I didn't want to send. It would suggest that our relationship was something that could be revisited, that the door I'd closed was still partially open. I hope he recovers completely, I told Sarah, and I hope he builds a life that makes him happy. But I won't be part of that life. She was disappointed. I could hear it in her voice, but she didn't argue. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that the mother who'd always put everyone else's needs first was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned to set boundaries and maintain them even when they were difficult. David did recover and eventually returned to New York. He remarried, I heard through the family network, a woman closer to his own age who'd recently lost her husband and understood the compromises that come with late-in-life relationships. I wished them both well and meant it, though I had no desire to meet her or to be included in their lives in any way. My own life continued to expand in small, satisfying ways. I moved to a slightly larger apartment, still in Brooklyn, but in a neighborhood with tree-lined streets and a corner cafe where I'd become a regular. Frank and I took a weekend trip to Vermont, staying in separate rooms at a bed and breakfast and hiking through forests that blazed with autumn colors. We'd never discussed marriage or moving in together, and I found that I preferred the relationship as it was, close enough for genuine intimacy, separate enough for individual freedom. After 40 years of having my schedule and preferences and even my thoughts shaped by someone else's needs, I treasured the independence I'd fought so hard to achieve. The pottery class had long since ended, but Frank and I continued to work with clay in my apartment, spreading newspapers on the kitchen table and losing ourselves in the meditative process of shaping formless earth into useful objects. My bowls were no longer crooked, my vases no longer prone to collapse, but I still loved the metaphor of transformation, of taking something shapeless and giving it purpose and beauty through patient work. On my 70th birthday, Mrs. Patel organized a small party in her apartment. Frank was there, along with my coworkers from the bakery, my book club friends, and Elena, who'd become a friend rather than just a lawyer. Even Sarah and Michael visited from their respective cities, bearing gifts and genuine smiles. As I looked around the room at these people who'd chosen to be part of my life, who valued my company for itself rather than for what I could provide them, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval or gratitude. Make a wish, Mrs. Patel urged as I prepared to blow out the candles on the elaborate cake she'd insisted on baking. I closed my eyes and thought about what I might want that I didn't already have. More time, perhaps, to explore the interests I'd discovered so late in life. Better health, to ensure I could enjoy that time. Continued connections with these people who'd become family in the truest sense of the word. But mostly, I wished for the wisdom to continue choosing myself when choices arose, to remember the lessons I'd learned so painfully but so completely about the difference between love and dependency, between generosity and self-sacrifice, between being needed and being valued. When I opened my eyes and blew out the candles, the room erupted in applause and laughter. Frank squeezed my hand, Mrs. Patel began cutting the cake, and conversations resumed around me in the warm, overlapping way of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Later that night, as I sat in my own apartment surrounded by birthday cards and small gifts, I thought about the woman I'd been when David walked through our door with Rebecca 3 years earlier. That woman had been shattered by his betrayal, had felt that her life was ending at 67 because the only identity she'd known was being stripped away. But that woman's life had needed to end. She'd been too small, too constrained by other people's expectations and needs, too willing to accept scraps of affection and call them love. The woman I'd become in her place was larger, more complex, more demanding of respect, and more generous with genuine affection. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick. There had been nights of loneliness, days of doubt, moments when I'd been tempted to accept David's inadequate settlement or return his desperate phone calls, or settle for being needed rather than truly wanted. But I'd pushed through those moments, supported by people like Mrs. Patel and Elena, who'd seen my worth even when I couldn't see it myself. I'd learned to trust my own judgment, to value my own opinions, to find satisfaction in my own company. Most importantly, I'd learned the difference between being alone and being lonely. David had been surrounded by people who needed things from him. Rebecca, who needed financial security. Children who needed his approval. Clients who needed his professional expertise. But at the end, when his health failed and his choices caught up with him, he'd found himself profoundly isolated, because none of those relationships had been built on genuine mutual respect and affection. I, on the other hand, had discovered that solitude could be peaceful rather than frightening, that independence was a strength rather than a failure, that the love I'd been seeking from others had first to be cultivated within myself. As I prepared for bed on my 70th birthday, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The face that looked back at me was older than the woman David had abandoned, lined with years and experience, but it was also more vibrant somehow. My eyes held confidence that hadn't been there before, and my posture reflected the quiet dignity that comes from knowing your own worth. Tomorrow would bring another day of choices. What to read, whom to call, how to spend the hours that belonged entirely to me. The possibilities stretched ahead like an open road, and for the first time in decades, I was eager to see where they might lead. This woman looking back at me from the mirror, this Margaret who set boundaries and pursued interests and chose her companions based on mutual respect, rather than family obligation or social expectation. She was someone I'd never had the chance to be during 40 years of marriage. She was someone David had never known and never would know, because she'd emerged from the ashes of his abandonment like a phoenix he'd unknowingly created. If someone had told me 3 years ago that David's betrayal would ultimately become a gift, I would have thought them cruel or crazy. But standing in my own bathroom, in my own apartment, surrounded by evidence of my own choices and accomplishments, I could see the truth in it. He'd intended to discard me when I was no longer useful to his vision of himself. Instead, he'd set me free to become someone I'd never imagined I could be. The woman he'd thrown away had indeed died that October night. But the woman who'd risen in her place was someone I was proud to know, someone I was still discovering, someone whose story was far from finished. And that, I realized as I turned off the light and settled into my own bed in my own room in my own chosen life, was the sweetest revenge of all. Not the revenge of anger or bitterness or attempts to hurt him as he'd hurt me, but the revenge of becoming so fully myself that his loss of me was revealed as the tragedy it had always been. Not for me, but for him. I'd spent 40 years being the woman he thought he wanted. Now I was spending my remaining years being the woman I'd always been underneath, waiting for permission to exist. The wait was over, and the life that stretched ahead of me belonged entirely to me. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled in the darkness, grateful for the unexpected journey that had brought me home to myself. Tomorrow would bring new choices, new possibilities, new chances to be fully and unapologetically Margaret. I could hardly wait to see what she would choose to do next. Have you ever felt trapped in someone else's vision of who you should be, only to discover your true strength when they walked away? Sometimes the most painful endings become the most beautiful beginnings. Please share your story in the comments below. Your journey might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. And if this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to help me continue sharing these stories of transformation and hope. Because sometimes the hardest part of living isn't surviving the betrayal. It's having the courage to become who you were always meant to be.